Welcome to Connecting the Dots, where we share our stories from the battlefield of consulting. I'm Jesus Moreno, and I'm joined by my colleagues today to talk about expert UX and why it matters.
Hi, I'm Chad Huff. I'm a UX lead.
Hi, my name is Jenny Wang. I'm a UX designer.
I'm Johnny Hill. I'm also a UX designer.
Hey, I'm Kareem Jamal, a senior architect.
And I'm Phil Gambling, the technical lead.
Okay, so today's topic is expert UX. And so I guess the first thing right off the bat is, how do we define expert?
Well, when I think about this, I start off thinking like maybe who they're not, and I think of like my parents or like the grandparents of the world. They're not an expert, but whenever I'm really thinking of who an expert is, it's the opposite of them. Somebody that's has specialized knowledge in technologies. They're specializing in a profession that requires some sort of advanced education or experience. Not that my mom and dad aren't brilliant people, but they aren't day in and day out dealing with really complex information at this point in their life, and I'm not designing for them.
Yeah, I would almost define it as someone like with an intimate knowledge about something, whether that's like a topic or a field or an industry or even like a particular process or workflow. I feel like almost a better term that I often hear in the UX world is like a power user, someone who really knows their way around a specific application or a specific process. They're just very familiar with it and know how to use it very effectively, and probably know more than the average person would.
Yeah, for me, expert users, they usually already have an existing tool and is very familiar with the tool. Could be a software or even a spreadsheet tool. And often the challenge will be they're so used to the tool, and when we design something new, how to make the transition to be smooth for them.
Right.
When you're comparing the breadth versus depth, these are the folks that are really into the depth part of it. They get deep into very specific stuff in their industry. And if the person says, "Hey, can I export this to Excel because I want to do more stuff on it?" that's probably a good sign that that person is at least some sort of expert user.
Right. They tend to be like the authority on the subject matter versus us as the designers or engineers, building solutions for them, right? Like,
Does that tend to help or hurt in the design process when the user comes with their kind of, this is how things should be done mentality?
I mean, I think you definitely need user feedback. Like when you're working with experts, you need to know, hey, how are you currently using this? What are your current processes like? That whole kind of discovery process is very important. But at the same time, recognizing, okay, well, there's still a design process we need to go through. And it may be that the idea or the intention behind the idea is good, but the execution might be a little bit off. But I think definitely having that feedback is a crucial part, because you don't want to be designing the wrong thing or emphasizing the wrong thing.
It does make it a little challenging at times where you sort of have to have the person unlearn some stuff, right? Because they're so set on the solution in their head that sometimes they won't see other possible, maybe even better solutions.
that's a great point. Just because Excel does it this way doesn't mean that that's the way that it has to be done forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like you run into expert user. It's kind of, you either run into the expert user who does, feel like they have all the answers. And then there's the other kind that are always deferring to you as, oh, you're the experts on this. I don't want to suggest anything, but you might actually really want that feedback and they're maybe being too timid to share it.
Right. Yep.
So when we design solutions for users, how are the solutions that we design for experts different than the solutions that we design for someone with a more, I guess, general knowledge or
Mhm.
less focused knowledge?
Well, in general, there's a broader set of patterns that you can use in kind of the typical non-expert experience. There's uh, just a simpler thing in terms of overall amount of information that you're having to convey and the number of actions and complexity of what you're designing. Um, with expert users, there's just a greater amount of information generally. There's the terminology that they're using in a language that you need to learn. Um, and just getting to that knowledge often requires research activities that you just uh, it's not as easy to participate in that because you need to get access to these expert users and motivation to get them to talk with you, which sometimes could require large amounts of money to motivate them if they're not, you know, aware of the immediate benefit of talking to you would provide them. So there's a lot of different factors that come to mind when thinking about the process of design for experts versus non.
Yeah, I think it's very important to know the working environment of experts, and that will result in different solutions. Like what kind of screen size and resolution they're using. Can they use a touch screen or they can only use keyboard or mouse? Um, and
Yeah.
do they like heavily use keyboard instead of mouse? If so, maybe we need to design the hotkeys for the experts. I need to test the tab key and see if that will focus on the right elements on screen in the right order.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's, from the design side, I think the building blocks are the same, kind of like Chad was saying. You have your basic patterns. It's kind of how you implement them and recognizing that there's a certain complexity that you need to account for expert users. I think the example's kind of been given of, well, yeah, think about Excel. Excel can be, seen as just a giant spreadsheet table thing, and you can do that same kind of table in, your notes app on your phone, but you can also go way deeper and do far more to the point where you can, create an entire application within Excel. So it's kind of that, same basic building blocks, but how you approach it and the overall goal is what's often different between sort of general novice users and experts.
Isn't there also like a tolerance for expecting a degree of training for a new expert user product versus something that's more consumer driven? Like, my new user experience for say something that's just a general use has like a training, a little wizard that guides you through your first time logging in and tries to help give you tool tips, whereas expert user product probably has some degree of like, well, there'll be some initial training and then they're going to use it day in and day out and just have everything memorized anyways. So it can be a little bit rougher at first. I mean,
Right.
like in my experience, what I've seen.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the expectation is that, there will be some training. At the same time, I think we're challenged with people, especially those that may be a little bit younger than me, aren't likely to want to read a manual or take training. They just want to jump in and have expectations that the tool would be easy to navigate and could help them. So having those kind of guides built, and, thinking about the process of how do we get from empty state to uh, states that have lots of data, and help people get through their process and workflows or potentially build what their workflow is within the product. Um, it gets more complex, but that's a great differentiator though.
Yeah,
with
as you're going through with the expert users, I think you can get sort of straight to the point and use the technical terms. Whereas if it's not an expert, you know, as mentioned, a little bit more training and sort of context sensitive help or tool tips on, you know, what these terms mean or what this thing is, and you know, some sort of bumpers or tool tips, you know, all over the place. Does this help get acquainted with it, and then that person starts becoming an expert and doesn't need those bumpers anymore.
Well, I think another factor with this is there's a few that come to mind, like the performance of the solution and what is the feedback given from the solution. That it's helpful to have amazing developers at Xpero to help us build quick, responsive applications. But there's also a factor of trust and like disclosure of where the data is coming from and how accurate and how up to date is this data, depending on the experience that we're designing for. The experts really need to be able to understand the information that they're being presented, and any kind of recommendation we may make or any kind of notification to fully understand like what it is that the system is asking them to do, and should they trust it.
Yeah, it's like the system needs to show its work, you know, like to
Yeah.
use a school analogy before, and it probably takes a while for that the users to trust, like, okay, every time I've gone behind the scenes and checked, it looked good, so I don't need it every time. But that's definitely, I think that comes up a lot in finance too. Is just like, what was the source of this data? You know, how do I, is this a source I would typically have gone to if I was doing this by myself?
And it's understanding, and then oftentimes quick understanding too, right? As mentioned earlier, like we need to know what environment they're operating under, how many screens they have up, how many apps they have up on each screen. So it's like they need to be able to quickly glance at it, understand it, and then move on to their next app, because you know, you're basically competing with all these other things. So you sort of need to have an idea of, hey, how loud and seizure inducing do my notifications and things need to be to get this person's attention and you know, convey the message clearly and quickly.
So Kareem, I worked with you on that project that you're thinking of with the seizure-inducing notifications, and one of the things that I was always shocked by was how much data there was on the screen. And to me, as a developer, most of it looked like noise for 90% of the time. But it seemed like the users got some real value out of it, and it seems like I think Johnny was the main designer on that product as well. Like you guys seem to be able to surface very relevant information for the experts. I guess kind of getting that signal to noise ratio right. How do you know what information to surface, or how do you figure that out?
Yeah, a lot of that comes back down to the user interview process and the discovery process. Because yeah, there were definitely parts of that particular project that felt very counterintuitive to me and my understanding of design, but was incredibly needed and valuable to the users we were designing for. So yeah, I may have broken some of the traditional rules, but it was for the benefit of the user who said, no, I really do need and benefit from doing things this way, because otherwise I won't see it, or I won't be able to find what I need in the time I need to find it. So it was a little bit counterintuitive. But once we had a better understanding and a relationship with both the client and the client's users, it helped to kind of make that path a little clearer to find the best way forward.
I think that's a key point to take away, is that oftentimes when you're working with expert users, you will find yourself having to break out of the current patterns, you know, the design patterns that are in place. Hey, there should be this much spacing in between, so it's, you know, easier to read. Oftentimes, expert users will push that limit and sort of force you out of that. And if you try to stay within that design system very strictly and stringently, then you'll have some friction there.
Yeah, to pick on finance again, that's a common nitpick we'll get early on, is there's too much white space, there's too much padding here. Just like more data, more numbers, you know, more density.
Yeah, data density is huge, right? Like there's, yeah, and some of the experts will say, I don't want to scroll. I want it all. And, they can learn, and they'll be the type of user that expects everybody else to be like them, and have intimate knowledge of the tool, same screen size and everything. And in some cases, as Danny mentioned, that is the case. We do talk to a very specific set of users that we know, okay, we're designing for this type of use. But in other cases, you have to kind of weigh the feedback that you're getting from those that you're talking to, that may be a stakeholder, but maybe they're not the actual end user. They may be getting some filtered feedback. So
yeah, and that's not even taking into consideration when you have apps that are used by multiple different kinds of users, where some may be experts and some may not be.
right.
So you may need to support, whether that's, an information density slider where you can say how intense you want, how much data you want on the screen at once, or it may be, supporting entirely different workflows and processes depending on the level of comfort the user has with the system. So there's a whole different conversation there to be had around not just talking about the expert users, but every user of the application and what they specifically may need. It can get messy quick.
Yeah. I was just last week, I was trying to give an analogy of this kind of situation for a product where it's basically be asked to design a calendar, and thinking about how a calendar is designed to be probably defaulted to a weekly view. So somebody's just thinking about this next week and what are we doing? But you may have a need for a monthly view, or that year-long view, and somebody that's looking a year out, has a different need, has different information that they're trying to get, but trying to use the pattern that we're using for the weekly view for all users and for just does not work, right? So you need to be able to think about, okay, well, what's the right amount of information to present within the UI, and it could be similar patterns. And again, it was just one of those things where everybody was trying to get a lot of information into what is a finite amount of screen real estate. So I thought that was just an interesting example of that almost anybody could relate to in using a calendar.
And I think as they become more of an expert, they want the density to increase, right? And so maybe some sort of progressive density, let's call it,
Right.
toggles and settings that users can adjust. Like Gmail does a good job of that, right? They have your default, comfortable, and compact settings, right? So as you get more familiar with the UI, you can start making the interface a little tighter and get more information on the screen. I feel the more expert you get, the closer the density becomes to like a singularity, right? They want everything just cramped and like packed into that one quick screen for quick digest.
Just a black hole of information.
The thing about information too, it's really interesting. I think we've been learning more and more about trying to get real data into our design process. As you can show experts mock-ups that don't have real data, and that can be a distraction point, or they maybe just completely don't give you the feedback you need to build for them because it doesn't apply to them. But that's also the challenge within the design process, is to be able to get realistic enough data to get that feedback. So I'm not sure if Danny or Johnny, if y'all experienced that recently, but I think that's been another factor for us.
Yeah, I think having a good grasp of accurate data is also important to make sure you're designing with the right uses in mind. Because if you're using dummy data and you think, okay, yeah, this will kind of work with what I'm envisioning, and then you find out, oh no, that doesn't scale well at all to the amount of information or even the kind of information users need, you're kind of you're stuck in a pretty rough spot, because then you kind of need to go back and say, oh, I didn't even realize this is what you're basically designing for the wrong problem.
Right.
So yeah, having that information and knowing how to scale it well, I think is super needed for expert users.
Yeah, my experience is it often requires the help from our customers to maybe export the existing data from the existing tool they're using. It could be a spreadsheet, and it would be great if we can connect spreadsheet with the design tool we use, but if not, we can just have a way to copy and paste the data in the design so it feels more real to the users.
Yeah.
I think that is another key point to keep in mind is when you're putting these wireframes and designs together, either make sure the data is obviously placeholder like lorem ipsum, or make sure that it's correct data. Because if it's close to correct, then it'll serve more as a distraction, because your expert users will start trying to analyze that data and start pointing out where it's wrong and stuff, which completely takes you away from the evaluating the design and understanding that.
So we've been focusing primarily on the UX side, but we have a few developers on the call. So I guess to you guys, have you guys noticed any differences between implementing UI when you're doing it for an expert user versus when you're doing it for a more standard user?
One thing you have to keep in mind for expert users is they really want to be able to fill out forms and just navigate the app quickly. So that requires a lot more keyboard navigation and keyboard shortcuts. Basically, how can I get through this app quickly without lifting a finger off the keyboard? So you sort of have to build that in. You have to have the tab orders and all that flow correct, so that the user can quickly just do their thing, not get annoyed, not have to mouse around corners of the app, and submit their forms or entries or whatever they want.
And then potentially just keyboard shortcuts that you could take even further, that every user wants to customize their key mapping. So not necessarily standard user to user, but it's like to what you're saying, Kareem, that the mouse is not necessarily their friend, and the keyboard, they want to keep their hands on the keyboard.
And then I guess the other thing you have to also keep in mind is performance, especially now that you're dealing with a lot of data density as well. You want to make sure it's responsive, and then keeping in mind the fact that there are multiple apps competing for the expert's attention at the same time. You need to make sure that it's fast, because if they're slow, the expert's is going to pause and just go to something else, and now you've lost their attention until they cycle around again.
Yeah. And then sort of counterintuitive to that, you're inherently, you may be dealing with a much smaller user base though. It's not like on Amazon where millions of people around the world are using it on a daily basis. The expert app, it might be a handful of people that use it, and maybe they check in once a day to get the data they need to go do what other tasks they're doing. So it's like some of those considerations on more like back-end server performance might not matter as much, because you can tolerate a little bit less parallel processing. For example, like maybe it's okay if this model just runs once a day and so comes and picks up in the morning, but the UI, the browser might get loaded up with a bunch of just a bunch of stuff in a huge massive grid, and like that still needs to be fast. Like the data needs to be generated, but it needs to be the UI to get to whatever answer it is that I'm interested in needs to be fast and snappy, like you're saying, Kareem.
Yeah, all that makes sense, guys. Really appreciate the conversation, and I think kind of in summary, we've talked about the different types of users that we design for. The experts being like the authority on the subject matter, and how we come up with and identify the patterns and the experience that we need to create for them and implement, in a speedy and performant way. It's something I enjoy getting to do at Expero. I think it's one of the reasons why all of us work for Expero, and get to enjoy the work that we do. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about this today, and I think we'll be talking about some more good stuff here in the near future. Thanks
All
for
right.
joining
Thanks,
us.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. We look forward to connecting with you next time.
Nailed it.
I felt so.
You think that worked? That's good enough.
That was
Yeah.
perfect.
We'll see how it
Yeah.
sounds on
We'll
the
fix-
I was waiting for Jesus to just finish it off and say thank you.
We'll fix it in post. Thanks, Marshall.
Oh,
Yeah.
man. Yes,
Marshall's the best.
Hi, Marshall.
Marshall,
All right.
make me sound smarter.
Please. Yeah, fix me.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.